Welcome to another episode in the KIPS Podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia, and I'm the president of KIPS and Time to Train Fitness. I have one of my favorite guests as usual, and I got one of my favorite topics. So we have Vincent Metzo back on the podcast, but also we're talking about education within the fitness industry. And I could say for myself, this is something that has, it's changed. It's adapted in terms of my thoughts on it, having worked on the education side of the fitness industry for almost my whole time. It's going on probably 12 years of working on the education side. You learn about accreditation, certifications, continuing ed, and I'll say the politics of it, and it all changes. So Vincent, first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Tyler. It's great to be back.
Yes, and I know that we've been joking that one of the things that you or I will say on this episode, because this is a topic that you and I are passionate about, and sometimes that passion goes in and out, but also we joke about it because I would say we care about education. We both think it's important. But before we get there, and I know that this is, I think, your third or fourth time on the podcast, can you actually just talk about what you're doing now in the fitness industry? Guess you go back to past episodes, here's history, but what are you doing now?
So right now I am the director of curriculum and content development for Lionel University. Lionel University is a fully accredited online university that specializes in exercise science. Mm-hmm. We have credit-bearing certificates, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, and a master's degree, all in exercise science and personal training.
Nice. Yeah. I know that there's actually some background with Lionel. I know for myself, I remember when I worked for a company called Nesta, we actually had a university arm of the company, and we would look at Lionel's predecessor. What was the name of that?
So Lionel was originally the International Sports Science Association College, or ISSA College of Exercise Science. And then the two organizations split, and Lionel went through a name change, obviously, to differentiate itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know that when I was working at the other company, it was mostly just looking at what the bachelors and the associates, how they were structured, to get an idea, because they had the, I think at the time it was DETC, but now it's DEAC, right, accreditation. And so just the structure of it, the curriculum, all that kind of stuff, to get an idea of, for lack of a better word, for copying it. And so small world that coming around talking about you with education. With this episode, though, I think that a good place to kick it off is for entry-level instructors. So let's say somebody that's looking to get in the fitness industry. What kind of value do you place on somebody that potentially they're going to school? Maybe they are going to university, getting associates, or getting a bachelor's in an exercise science related field. What do you think about that?
Well, first off, let me say that the opinions stated herein are my personal opinions, and are not the opinions of Lionel University or any of its subsidiaries, as it were. So I'm just talking as an individual here who's been in the fitness industry for a long time. And I think the main test, I don't know if you've heard the 2 beers and a puppy test, but I have the would I let them train my mother test.
Okay.
Unfortunately, my mother's deceased now, but you get the idea. Would I trust somebody to work with my mother? And without knowing that person individually, and without actually assessing their work experience, as well as their personality, the main thing to make that decision quickly is, do you have a degree? Did you actually study this? Right? Now, can you make a wrong assessment that way? Yeah, but usually it's going to be on a personality, interpersonal, ethical grounds as opposed to on a knowledge kind of grounds.
Yeah. Yeah. I could say from experience in terms of thinking back to when I was in my bachelor's degree, I mean, you have you get a wide variety of topics, including working with the active aging population, working with athletes, working with special pops, different things that you don't necessarily get in a certification. I think that that's always been looking at the differences. And I mean, going back to this, I'm going back to the mind frame that I had when I graduated. I'm working for Nesta and I'm thinking, okay, am I more prepared than somebody that just has a entry level certification? And I could say yes. I mean, I think if you graduate with a degree, that you can take any certification in my mind, and you don't even necessarily have to read the book. You could, and I've, not to brag, but I've done it. And it's one of those things where you have the knowledge already. So then why does our industry place the value on, you need to get a certification? What do you think? Where does that kind of play out in your mind?
Well, when you were talking about that, I was thinking back for a second, and then I'll answer your specific question. But another criteria that one could use is affiliation. And I had been looking through my mother's stuff, and way back in the 1970s, my mother and my father joined the New York Health and Racquet Club. And I found in some of my mother's really old stuff a sort of cardstock kind of thing that had the name of all the machines and then the date. And then the trainer had written in, what weight she should put on each machine and how many reps she had done. And in talking to other people as well in the industry, which we'll probably come back to, on the job training and that affiliation of, okay, the person is working in New York Health and Racquet Club. New York Health and Racquet Club has trained them. Right. And so as long as they're within a reasonable scope of practice, I think that's also a type of credentialing, even if it's not an official credential, but it's the idea that this person is associated with a gym, with a bigger organization. And I think the more money you're paying for your gym membership, and the nicer the tiles and mirrors and the number of ferns and how clean it is and all of that, I think that also plays a big role into how much the consumer is going to trust the trainer, regardless of whether the trainer is certified or has a degree. Just because of the way the place looks, well, they must be good, right? Because they work here. Now, in answer to your other question, I think certification is a very interesting area in fitness, because back in 2010, International Health Racquet Sports Club Association said, we're mandating that all membership clubs hire trainers who have third-party certifications, right? Third-party accredited certifications. And the main third-party accreditation that they looked for was NCCA, right? Now they've expanded that. And if you look on IHRSA's website, you'll see DEAC, which you mentioned before. And there's another one, I can't remember the name of it, NCHP or something, which accredits certification organizations. So, you assume back then that they did this to protect the public, right? And to say, okay, there's a standard in the fitness industry. But how did these organizations suddenly become the gatekeepers for the industry? And if each accrediting organization or actually, I should say, if each credentialing organization, meaning ACE, NASM, NESTA, ISSA, NSCA, ACSM, etc., each of them has to be accredited by NCCA or another third-party accreditor, they have to do a job analysis. So basically, this means that 30 different accrediting organizations, 30 different credentialing, certifying organizations for personal trainers have all done a job analysis about personal training. So how can a NASM personal trainer be different from an ACSM personal trainer if they've both done this job analysis, allegedly? And how can a NASM personal trainer, for example, have to answer questions about the OPT model, but an ACSM personal trainer doesn't have to answer those kind of questions, right? And then for higher levels of certification, some of the organizations have tried to create a delineation by saying you have to have a bachelor's degree to even sit for this exam, or you have to have a bachelor's degree in a related field like kinesiology, exercise science, etc., to even sit for this exam. And there was an organization called NBFE, the National Board of Fitness Examiners, that tried to get everybody together and advocated for licensure, right, and standardization across the industry. And then you've got to wonder, okay, IHRSA said this back in 2010, but why did they say it? Did they say it to protect the public, or did they say it as a compromise? Because actually, commercial fitness chains don't want to have to pay trainers a higher amount, a salary, because they're licensed and have a degree. Because all of a sudden now you're working with, basically somebody who's like a physical therapy assistant or a certified nurse assistant or somebody who actually has a license and an education that's standardized to get here. So now you have to pay them. So you got to wonder, was somebody saying, we want licensure, and the clubs were going, nah, we just want to pay people for production, right? And then IHRSA said, okay, well, let's compromise and say, we want to have a standard, but we don't want that to be an education or a licensing standard. We want it to be here. So both stakeholders, the main employers and people who want to elevate the profession, can be happy. Conspiracy theory.
I'm going to...
Completely theoretical.
I'm laughing because... I'm going to interject here with some to add fuel to the fire. And I would say that this is stuff that I've never said in any podcast before, despite, thinking about it. But, it's sad for me to say this, but there used to be a time where, you'd fear IHRSA because of the retaliation. But, with the work that I do now, it's more, I don't work within that circle as much. And you come across gyms that don't agree with some of the policies of these. And, but I could say that I know someone that, so this hypothetical, how do they come up with this? Here's the route we're going to go. So I'm going to, like I said, add fuel to the fire here. I know someone that kind of explained this meeting as a kind of like a Godfather roundtable that a lot of these organizations, they met in an area. I think it was outside of a conference, and they basically said that we're going to go for this accreditation. Here's why we want to do it. And, this was our reasoning for it. And so the individual that I know that was there, they didn't agree with it for many reasons, but like I said, they kind of explained this whole conversation as more of like a Godfather. Okay, if you don't do this, we're going to, ban you. We're going to make sure that you don't get your accreditations. And that's kind of as far I'm going to go with that conversation. But another part of this that I thought you said was very interesting with the GTA, the job task analysis. Now, a little background for our listeners. I have done or been a part of 3 different NCCA applications, and I have spearheaded one of them. And I know probably more than the overwhelming majority of people in the fitness industry about the application process, how to do it, and all the steps that are needed for it. With the GTA, that was actually my biggest argument. I managed to make that when I worked for one of the companies that probably you would consider in the top 10 of fitness education companies. That why doesn't everybody share the GTA, the job task analysis? If we are all trying to do the same thing in terms of this is the profession, personal trainers, fitness instructors, and this is what we would say is the acceptable knowledge or the task of a fitness instructor. Why isn't everybody sharing it then? That was my big argument. Mm-hmm. And I could get, of course, I mean, this is all just office talk. Of course, people would agree with me, but I mean, really the answer was politics. And because of what you said after that, this is the truth that in theory, that no other in theory, I believe that anybody that takes, let's say they take the ACE personal trainer program, the manual, they take the course, in theory, they should be able to take, let's say, NSCA's personal trainer exam. But we know that from this conversation, but even just going through these manuals, there are training models that are copyrighted by different agencies that are inside of these exams, which in theory should not be. I believe these are even NCCA regulations that you can't have those types of theories on your examination. And so it creates this whole question of, well, why does an agency have to have that then? And why aren't they sharing these resources? And I mean, it almost becomes a conversation about business, about society, and it goes down that route. And then ultimately it's well, are we actually benefiting the fitness instructors? Are we actually benefiting the end goal of it, which is your clients? Yeah. Exactly, the clients. And so I'll say that.
And are we benefiting society on the whole? Because, even before the pandemic, we had 1 in 3 people obese in this country and all of these lifestyle diseases. And we still can't break that 18% of the population who are, actively involved in the fitness industry. As consumers, so we have 80% of the population that's unfit, that this system that we're using is still unable to reach in any meaningful way.
A quick little promo break here in this episode. If you're a fan of the KIPS podcast, you know that at some point there's a promotion for the Naboso Duo insoles. I just pulled these out of my shoes, gave them a quick rinse to get the sock dust off of them, and I wanted to talk about them because they're great. They're fantastic. They make an impact on your daily life. If you sit at a desk or if you're on your feet, sometimes your feet just feel achy, or maybe they feel like they went to sleep. That's for myself. I felt like after working a full day that my feet did not want to go to the gym, work out, do something active, and it led to some bad habits. But with these, I feel more active. I feel I can do more things, and I've been using them for over a year now. With your clients, with your family, with your friends, share them, talk about them, see what they think, because they really do make a difference. If your feet feel more active, you're going to be more active, and that equates to being more healthy. Check them out. There's a link in the description. See what all the products they have, and let's get back to this episode. Yeah. It becomes one of those things where you're 100% right. We're not helping the end user. We're not helping the instructors. We're not helping break these habits. It almost seems like a broken model. And, I've done 1 or 2 NBFE applications. Actually, I've done 3. And, that process of going down either licensure, going down that route. It's one where there are models to look at, but then I've talked about this in different podcast episodes about, is it right? Should we go down that route? Who is going to benefit? Who's going to essentially be kicked out of the industry? But then there's always the business end of it. Education companies, they got to make money, and the current model allows them to make money, which is, being a business owner myself,
they're not really, I mean, you called them education companies, but they're not really education companies. They're certification companies, and they make their money by selling certifications, which you need to get your foot in the door in the industry. And then to support that, they add education. But that's not education, as good as it may be. It's not education that follows a Carnegie unit standard or you would get in college, you know. So it becomes a slightly different thing. They sell education in order to be able to sell more certifications.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of bring back a point that I made earlier in terms of a degree versus a certification, and this is a point that I've made many times throughout my years in the industry, a chapter within an entry-level certification, a chapter, maybe 35 pages at 45, maybe at most, students that are getting their bachelor's, they will take a whole course on that topic. And so you're supposed to understand topics that a student will spend a whole semester on, when you're just given literally just little tidbits to hopefully, make it sound like you know what you're talking about. But there's no way that any certification weighs close to. And I've seen this actually, I feel like pretty recently, there was an argument. And if you're on Twitter, you know that Twitter is an interesting space, but with Twitter, there was an argument about certifications versus even like degrees, and people were bringing in interns and all this whole like long chain with a pretty popular, I'll say, strength coach in the fitness industry. And in my mind, there's just no way that you could put any certification even close to any type of exercise science related degree for that fact.
But then when you finish your exercise science degree, you need to get a certification in order to get a job in the gym.
Yeah.
Right.
That's one of those things where I don't understand that, especially as I've gone through even my years in the industry. And there's been times where actually I've worked in a gym without one. And because of the manager either knew me or knew that I have education. And, that's one of those things where they'll say, oh, it's for insurance purposes. But I've heard from people that have, sat in courtrooms where personal trainers are being sued. And I believe that you might even have more experience with this as well, that they've told me how it really comes down to the education of the instructor. Can you prove that this instructor in this courtroom that's being sued, that they are knowledgeable to teach that exercise or instruct clients? And if they can't say yes, then it doesn't really come down to certification or bachelor's degree. It comes down to, okay, what are their credentials? What do they have? And I mean, I feel like that's the big point right there. What do you think about that?
Well, I have been an expert witness on a couple of cases. And to me, it comes down to not necessarily showing the education, but comparing their behavior to the standard of care. Did they do an intake? Did they interpret the data on that intake correctly? Did they do what a prudent personal trainer would do? And that to me has been the main thing. And I've seen people working at different gyms and also at with different levels of education and different certifications that didn't, behaved in a way that did not meet the standard of care.
Yeah.
I looked at the person and we started doing this. And it's like, well, in what world does that show prudent judgment? How does that make any sense? But yeah, it brings up an interesting question about licensure. I mean, if you want to practice law, you need a JD. If you want to practice medicine, if you want to practice massage therapy, you need a license in most states.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be a chiropractor, physical therapist, etc., you need a license.
Yeah.
But then we get into the idea of, well, what amount of education is required to be able to pass that licensing exam, or what type of education along with that licensing exam shows that you have the competencies to do this work.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's actually a good segue to another question or another area that I'd planned for us to talk about because of your work experience. You've worked for gyms. You've also worked for education companies, and you've worked on both sides in terms of inside the gym and even with teaching education at a I think calling it a vocational school. I believe that's what the Swedish Institute used to be. And a big thing that I've always talked about with people entering the industry is finding a good gym that's going to onboard you and teach you how to be an instructor, teach you how to set people up, how to assess them, how to guide them, and also the interpersonal skills of it. Because if you just get a certification from any company, you're probably still confused. Where do I start? Where do I go? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have this piece of paper, this cardstock piece of paper that says that you can train people, but they don't really guide you on what to do next. And some gyms, they expect you to already have that type of, they already expect you to have experience. And you're like, but I just got certified. With onboarding, what are some of the characteristics that you think that a gym should hopefully, that they should hopefully have to set a new instructor up for success? What do you think?
Well, I think that, from my personal experience coming into the industry, first off, I started off as a dancer. So learning exercises, teaching movements was something I had been around my whole life. Mm-hmm. But I was very lucky early on to be trained by a woman, to have a mentor who was well educated and really knew what they were doing. Mm-hmm. And, we would go into the gym and we'd be doing shoulder presses or whatever. And she'd be telling me, deltoid originates here and attaches here. And if you do it with your elbows in here, that's the sagittal plane. You do it out here, that's the frontal plane. And this is the way you should put together the workout, large to small, fast to slow, et cetera, et cetera. And so I had a mentor, and then I started my education. Then I bought the ACE book originally. Actually, I don't know if I showed this last time, but I dug this out a while ago. But this is my original ACE certification from 1992, right? And so I got that, and then I decided, hey, I want to do this, but I'm kind of a skinny kid, right? I was in my 20s, and I was like training at a gym called Pumping Iron. And,
Nice.
These guys were like 3 times as wide as me, and I was like, so I need some credibility. How am I going to, appear credible with these, superhero looking guys around me? Mm-hmm. And so I decided to get a master's degree. And I was lucky that in getting a master's degree, it supported so much of what I had learned, because I had good dance instructors and I had a good mentor. And I think that combination of education with a really good mentor or hands-on experience was useful. In my master's degree, I had to do an internship. Mm-hmm. That was sort of the hands-on part of where you're going to learn to lift and program and actually work with people. And that was helpful, but I wouldn't have even gotten my internship if I hadn't have worked with my mentor and already known what I was doing.
Yeah.
And if I was only relying on what I learned in my internship, then I'd be really good at doing ACSM submaximal bike tests and skin fold measurements and taking people through selectorized equipment. But I wouldn't know ollie lifts. I wouldn't know free weights. I wouldn't know all of this other stuff that I knew. So at the end of the day, theoretically, that should work. But when most gyms do their onboarding is not about how to train people, right? You know, if you're lucky, you get a week of that. Their onboarding is about how to sell personal training sessions.
Yeah.
Right? And personally, I could have used a little of that because I had the other boxes checked, right? But if that's all you're getting, then you're not going to have that client retention. And I had clients that I worked with for 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
So again, what's the standard, right? What does that mean? Because if you work at a commercial big box gym, you have a very different onboarding, mentorship, hands-on, on-the-job training than you do if you work at a YMCA or a JCC, right? Yeah. Versus now if you work at a CrossFit box or, you know, an independent mom and pop kind of gym. So there's again such a wide berth, and you would hope that education would set you up with the knowledge, skills, and abilities to be able to work in any of those situations, and to know that when you come into the gym and it's, you know, 6:30 in the evening on a Wednesday night and the place is freaking packed, you're not all scared and going over to the dumbbells and going, okay, do some bicep curls, but you have 10 different ways that you can start with a multiple joint exercise and still get this person a good workout.
Yeah, I think I know from when I first entered the industry, I think it was, I was very grateful that I landed where I did. I remember I applied to 3 different gyms, and I actually didn't get into the 24-hour fitness. I just wasn't quality enough, but I got into a gym that they were a higher end gym. If you live on the West Coast, you probably, they now own that company. At first it was called Spectrum, then it became Bay Club. And when I first got hired, they had about a 3-month onboarding process. And if you didn't make it past, if you didn't sell a certain amount of money. So the goal is you have to sell a certain amount of money. So I think that is it's on theory, or like if you first hear it, you're like, oh man, that's pretty scary. You have to sell a certain amount. Yes, that's part of the job. As you said, that is part of the job of being a personal trainer in a gym. If you can't sell yourself as a fitness instructor, the gym's not going to make any money off of you. So they have to bring in another batch. But so after, in that 3-month period, that probation period, you got to sell a certain amount. But I had class sessions where they would take you through an hour. Also that process of building the relationship with a client. And mine didn't have as much of the science part, the book part, the theory part, but I've heard of other companies or other organizations, one of them being Equinox. I've only met instructors that have gone through their program. And I always say that they're some of the most prepared instructors that I've met. So that whenever they leave Equinox, I still think they're very solid instructors, and they've been in the industry for multiple years, which I think is a sign of in itself, saying that you meet a lot of people that, they tried it, they got their certification, they end up leaving because they just couldn't stick around. I think some of the instructors I've met from Equinox are solid across the board because of their onboarding process. And so I think you hit it on the nose that you got to have both. You got to have the application part, you got to have the business part, because those are some of the skills that will hopefully help you stay in the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, respect to Equinox and nothing against Equinox. However, there's a little flaw in the statistics there, in that they still have the same turnover rate, right, that all the other commercial gyms have, maybe a little bit better. But somebody who manages to make it through that Equinox training program, if you will, that onboarding program, already is a certain kind of individual. So they were already prepared interpersonally, personality-wise, time-wise, to be able to make it in that system. Good Whereas point. Other people who might be equally as good technical trainers, equally as good in other aspects of being able to do that job, were not able to make it through because they couldn't camp out at the gym for X amount of hours to build their book. Yeah. So, and one other thing that occurred to me is there is a certain reality of being a personal trainer in a commercial fitness gym that lends itself to being a single, handsome 20-something with no family, right, and a very stable home life. And then you can spend all that time at the gym building your clientele.
Yeah.
But if you have other obligations, right, and you don't fit the costume, you don't look the part, then regardless of the fact that you might know really well what you're doing and be able to educate people and help people change their behaviors to more healthful ones, you're not going to be successful in that particular environment. Plus which, let's remember that going to all the stakeholders, all the people in that gym are not getting personal training. They're not necessarily getting their needs met or getting their goals achieved, because most gyms they're lucky if 10% of their membership actually gets personal training. So my point being, ultimately, though we can look at little success stories, if we really get meta about it, the whole system is broken.
Yeah.
Right? The whole system is completely on its side, and people aren't getting healthy. And colleges are not teaching students to work in that environment. Colleges are still teaching students that there is this magical world where, as a personal trainer, you're going to get a salary. You're going to be able to work in an environment that is healthy for you, right? Where you can still have work-life balance. But actually, that's not the case. If you're in the fitness industry and you're working in a commercial gym, that's not a place for work-life balance, because you're dollars for hours, right? And if that's great. If you can get enough clients to work 40 sessions a week, but keep in mind that those 40 sessions are going to be in the morning and after work.
Yep.
Right. So what sort of lifestyle is that exactly? And, that's great for people who manage to make it there, or people who manage to make it out of that into something that does have balance. And probably the key is to making it out of that hamster wheel is education. And being able to think outside the box and not only have the technical education to deliver a good product, but also have the business education to be able to market and sell and get investors to be able to develop that product. And then maybe you can have a work-life balance. But when you have that work-life balance, are you going to be shoving off the long hours onto other kids who don't have a work-life balance anymore, because in order for you to make money and for your gym to survive, other people have to pick up the slack and run themselves into the ground to do that.
Yeah, I think that is the reality of it, of being a new instructor. And I mean, I know that I can share that a few times. That I remember one time I had to really try to convince the fitness manager that I had the availability, because they do expect you to be available at every single hour and to be there at a bunch of varying hours, early morning, late evening, because they're trying to get you in front of people, and you're basically staking yourself out, trying to just talk to that one person to sell a package. And it's exactly what you say. You're not going to have a work-life balance unless you've been in the industry for, I can't say that, unless you get to that level. Because I don't know how long it's going to take. That takes people. Mm-hmm. It takes people variety, and I could say that some instructors that I've known that got to that when I used to work in a gym that, I'll say, cultivated that type of environment that you could be a full-time instructor. That exactly what you said: early morning, late evening, or the one or two that had that just straight 7-hour block. They had been there a long time, and they really worked to get it to that place that they just had that 7-hour block of sessions Monday through Friday. But that is literally, like, what do they call that? The white rabbit. That's literally the unicorn for instructors. You're never going to get to that. Mm-hmm. Or I don't want to say never, but it's something to strive for. I got to keep a positive spin on this, but it's very hard to get there. And so, it's a tough one. I think that where I want to shift this conversation here is to continue education, because this is actually a topic that a friend of mine who's a fitness manager in the Pacific Northwest, he had asked me in the last year, that what do I think, having worked in a gym, owning KIPS, which is an education company, what do I think about gyms paying for continuing education? From his perspective, he had an instructor that was asking about it. What do you think about this conundrum within the industry?
It's a very interesting question, and I see it from a couple different points of view. So historically, I remember back in the early 90s when I started out, I went to conventions, symposiums, and I got my continuing education units. And maybe we should start there. So even back then, if you wanted to keep your certification current, one of the things that makes it a certification as opposed to a certificate is that there's this continuing education requirement. Mm-hmm. So you need to do continuing education units so that you can recertify every 2 years or 3 years, or depending on whichever organization you're with. So back in the day, these continuing ed opportunities were symposiums. So you would go and there would be a bunch of PhDs who came in and lectured, and maybe it was about their research or about an area of interest, whatever. Then continuing ed seemed to shift. And all of a sudden it became more about how can we offer continuing education that doesn't just improve your knowledge, but improves your marketability, if you will, that allows you maybe to be a better employee because you can now offer different services. You can offer the kettlebell class or the Indian club class or the medicine ball class or the functional fitness class or whatever it is, or the TRX class, right? So then we started seeing things, well, take a weekend continuing education course and learn how to train with kettlebells, and then get your level 2 kettlebell certification, then get your TRX certification. Then, now you're a sought after employee because you could do a kettlebell TRX fusion small group training, and that's going to help the gym, help you, et cetera, et cetera. So continuing education is a good thing, but there are some questions as to exactly what the point of it is. On another plane, continuing education also gets into this idea of upskilling, which we hear a lot about in higher education. It's like you've been working at your job at H&H accounting firm for 10 years, and all of a sudden Intuit comes out with some new software. So now we need to take you and we need to put you through this weekend Intuit class so that you can learn the new software and you're upskilled, right? We don't get rid of you, but we train you to be able to use whatever this new software is. And clearly in coding and technology and all, Google Analytics and Amazon Web Services and all of that stuff, that's big. Right. Mm-hmm. So we see, okay, we have this guy who's a coder, but he needs to learn Python, or he needs to learn that, or she needs to learn this. So the fitness industry has always worked that way. But the problem is that none of those things ever add up to a degree. Right. It's like I can take 100 continuing ed workshops, and at a certain point, I realized, wow, this is, 90% of this is the same thing I learned 3 years ago when I did this kettlebell course. And even though we're doing sandbags now, I'm, still getting this sort of refresher in functional anatomy or applied anatomy or whatever it is. And none of it is adding up to anything. It's just feeding the machine of my continuing education that I need to be able to keep my certification current and be able to keep on doing the same job I'm doing. And I can't tell you how many times I've taught continuing education courses and why are you here? What's your interest in this particular topic? I just need my continuing ed units. They're not planning on learning this thing so that they can bring it to their gym and create another revenue stream. They're just there because they kind of have to be on some level.
Yeah.
Last thing I'll say about it is a number of my students, I taught at Swedish Institute, as you know, for more than 20 years, and I ran the personal training program there for 16 of those years. And a lot of the students that I trained, at a certain point, they told me, I'm going to these continuing education units, but I already learned it in school, right? I mean, if you have a degree, whether it's an associate's or a bachelor's or a master's even, for the most part, you're going to these things and like, I had that in my biomechanics class. Yeah, I had that here. Yeah. But two, they're like, why am I doing this? I have this education and I have to go through these motions. I learned some cool things. I learned about the blood restriction thing and I use that. And maybe I got the kinesio tape or the hypervolt and I'm using that with my clients. And it's, that's bringing me some more income. But everything else, I'm just doing this every year. Where can I get my own insurance without having to keep my certification current? And actually you can go directly to an insurance company and get professional liability insurance and show them your education, that you had certifications, and they'll write you a business policy.
Yeah.
And you don't need to have a certification, because either you already had it or you have the education that's in place of it, or you're willing to pay high enough premiums that they're willing to insure you even if you're not certified.
Very good points there, Vince. And I think it's one of those things that I don't know the answer for it with continuing ed and where to go with it. And it's one of the, I'll say, the sad realities of our industry. But let's now get to the podcast takeaways. And throughout this episode, I've been thinking about ways to actually switch this this question because talking about education, I want to keep it on track with that. So Vince, and I'm going to keep it not in terms of myths, but Vince, what are 2 ways that you feel like we can improve the education within the fitness industry? And you can take it however you want.
There are 2 parallel paths that may sound mutually exclusive, but I don't think should be. One of them is that I think that we need to focus on prerequisites, like you need to take musculoskeletal anatomy and kinesiology and exercise physiology, and those need to be the foundations of everything you do, right? You need to learn those principles and you need to learn them well. Mm-hmm. That becomes your bullshit detector, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is on-the-job practical training that goes beyond learning how to sell, right? That has a prescribed idea, a prescribed curriculum of what skills and abilities you should have in terms of both exercise testing, different exercise modalities, and working with clients, working with actual people.
Yeah.
So I think those 2 things parallel, and it becomes very much like the software industry working with the other industries, whether they're accounting, etc. So, here's the industry. We have this need for qualified fitness professionals. This is what we're identifying in our area. How can we get these expert things to fill in and upskill, reskill our workers so that they can best serve our population?
Great insight there and response. I can say that in this episode, I shared some things that I never thought I would probably share in a podcast, and I'm happy that we recorded this, and I hopefully it helps with instructors out there potentially getting in, but also instructors that listen in and they're wondering about these things with education industry that they work in, and so I'll make sure to throw some links in the description for how listeners can find out information for Lionel University, find information for Vince on social media platforms. But of course, Vince, thank you for coming on again, being my guest, and sharing some great insight into education in our industry.
Thank you, Tyler. It's great to be back. Always fun to talk to you about this stuff.